Welcome again to a channel titled Cosmopolis. As you know that we pride our podcast channel to be having this eclectic range of playlists beginning from the story of science to exploring the cosmopolitan city of Bangalore or politics and stuff like that. And today's conversation may be very hard to categorize into any single such playlist, but we are very glad to have Dr. Rajesh Kasturirangan with us. At present, he only reveals that he is the CEO of a foundation called Socratus, which is, as he says, meant to midwife the process of generating collective wisdom. But earlier, he has been a researcher and a teacher. He's worked at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. He is a PhD in the brain sciences and a PhD in mathematics. And today, in some sense, the central topic of our conversation is going to be this book called Who Are We? An Enquiry into the Indian Mind and How We Came to Be Who We Are. And the reason it's great is because I see this as a kind of a culmination of all the knowledge he has gathered over time. Yeah, so we're going to, is this fine, right? So we're going to talk about it. So welcome again, Professor.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so right away, when I read your book, and I'll just jump with I thought that it was quite strategic. You put your question as who are we rather than who am I, because you could still say that as an individual Indian, who am I? But I think what I found interesting when I read the book, that it makes sense that you called it Who Are We? Am I right when I think like that? So,
and especially because the who am I question has a lot of resonance in Indian philosophical traditions, actually many philosophical traditions, right? Which is, what is the self? What makes the self what it is? So the we signals that it's no longer about the individual self.
Yeah. And so when I was reading this, the first question that came to my mind is this question of the style itself of the book, because I'm a student of in some sense I've also had a journey across disciplines, so I don't have I'm not like very faithful to any discipline, but being in the humanities, the social sciences, what struck me is the kind of utility with which you summon concepts from different disciplines, almost showing a certain irreverence to them at one level, and that style has been very helpful because to me the marriage between cognitive science and say something like cultural studies is something very difficult, as I see in most Indian universities, because certainly in, let's say, IIT Delhi, for example, where I did my PhD, psychology is in some sense is in a different part of the polarization. It pitches itself as something more rational and scientific as compared to the cultural studies, right? So how did you think about that marriage?
It's an interesting question, right? I mean, part of it is, of course, if you look at the history of how the discipline of psychology emerged, it emerges in Germany in the late 19th century. The first experimental psychology lab, Wilhelm Wundt's lab, is around that time, right? So it's part of the division of labor of the university that comes hand in hand with the division of labor that you're seeing in society, with specialized manufacturing and other disciplines emerging, right? And what I had always wanted to do is to say, not to deny those disciplinary boundaries, but not to accept them either, right? So to leave those as question marks rather than as taken for granted. And psychology in particular, on this end, as you know, in the last 50 or so years, has become more and more integrated with the neurosciences, right? So at least one part of psychology is how the brain affects experience and behavior, and you could say that that's the most well-funded and even maybe the most prestigious part of psychology in the West, at least today, right? As opposed to clinical psychology, I mean the more service-oriented versions of psychology where people are using it for therapeutic purposes.
Yeah, and one of the things, like if we hold on to the question of psychology, is that occurred to me when I was reading, is that and that's what I find the marriage very interesting, that there are places when you look at colloquial Indian usage of language, like for example, I was reading that part where you talk about the phrase "uska dimag kharab hai," and what does that say about how Indians perceive the mind or our mind. To a cultural studies person, such a recourse to ordinary language to extract wisdom, serious wisdom about culture, is perfectly legitimate, right? But for a psychologist, they might say that you're doing what is called as folk psychology, right? And I think in some sense, to make sense of our world, all of us have to be folk scientists, folk physicists, folk psychologists, folk anthropologists.
Right.
So, if somebody levels that charge on you, do you see that as a criticism, or do you see that as a necessity of how discipline should function?
So earlier in the book, I say that this is an exercise in cognitive studies, right? So which, as you can say, has the cognitive in the cognitive science and the studies in the cultural studies, right? And why I say that is, let's take something like the "uska dimag kharab hai," or in Bangalore, where we are right now, you might say "solpa adjust madi," right? I mean, I'm sure you have all heard of that. The question is that a genuine window into how our minds work, or is it just some random thing you just said, right? I have treated it as a genuine insight, but it's actually not divorced from very mainstream practices in the cognitive sciences, right? So if you want to study linguistics, you will build your theories on the basis of everyday language.
True.
I don't think everyday experience is divorced from laboratory experience, and especially today with the kind of technologies that we have, we should be able to again do cognitive studies because you can collect data in the field in a way that the cultural studies person would be much more comfortable with, right?
One of the, for me, because you might pardon me because it just could be that I'm out of touch with how cognitive science has evolved, because you used an interesting term, cognitive studies, right? There is a sense in which to outsiders of cognitive science, the cognition, how this category became like a way of approaching everything. So for example, what you try to say in this book is that when you try to, I'm paraphrasing it in my own way, when you study society, a sociologist is by default interested in the cognition of the society, right? Or a person who is any other person, for example, a political scientist is interested in the cognition of politics, right? So could you talk more about this process of expanding the concept of cognition to?
I think I'm proud of it, but a fair criticism could have been that this is a somewhat imperialistic idea of cognition, In the same way that, let's say, economics is often labeled as an imperialistic social science, right? That you can study marriage using economics. Of course, you can also study markets using anthropology, right? So, but the claim has been that economics is a universal social science that allows you to study all human social activity using these principles of utility and, and equilibrium and other concepts. So I do think that cognition in that sense is a little bit like that. It's both an everyday term, something that describes what we do as human beings, but also a technical term that can be used to analyze all social phenomena.
Yeah, and especially when you talk about cognitive systems, right? The term that you've coined called society,
right,
where it seems like you're talking about this adaptability, and if I just extend it, the intelligence of certain systems.
Yes.
And to some extent, that intelligence amounts to the system having a cognition of sorts.
Yeah.
This paradigm itself, like when I was thinking about it, in that sense, this paradigm is not new. Like there have been other thinkers who bring this in their own ways. I was thinking about, say, somebody like Whitehead, who would talk about who would, not be averse to talk about the intelligence of non-human beings, let's say, right? That would be a slightly careful way of putting it. Or let's say someone like another thinker, somebody, I don't know if you must have read him, called Gabriel Tard, who talks about societies at every level. So for example, I thought about society when I was Gabriel Tard, because Gabriel Tard is basically one of the first founders of anthropology as a discipline. And for him, society, just like you talk about cognition, society is a way of looking at things. So our body is a society of cells,
yes,
right? The traffic is a society of cars.
Yes.
Communities are societies of individuals, right? So in that sense, what is your kinship with these thinkers, if you could?
It's quite explicit actually, because in fact I have mentioned here that just as society has a noun and a verb form,
yeah,
right? So does cognition.
Yeah.
And you could say that society is one theory, that the verb form of society, which I get through, I guess eventually from Tard, but really through Bruno Latour, who is a great fan of Tard.
Yeah.
I'm generalizing Latour's idea of society as a theory of connection to cognition as a theory of connection, right? The only difference is that, at least in the founding idea of cognition, the idea of generalization and learning and intelligence, so to speak, is built into it, which is not obviously there even in the connection idea of society.
I agree. I see what you're saying.
So that adaptiveness,
yeah,
right,
yeah,
is sort of the additional feature that cognition is adding that society or the social doesn't have built into it.
Yeah. Would you say that, I'm just trying to think about, how certain concepts have a certain currency because of the technological conditions that enable it. The way you talk about cognition and how it has the idea of learning and adaptability built into it is probably because the way it manifests in what we call as artificial cognition or intelligence.
Absolutely.
So because of that technological concept,
right,
the idea of that technology, it's as if cognition is now synonymous with the idea of adaptability and if you like, learning, which is not true, as you said, with the question of society, the
yes,
social.
Yes.
Would you?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
And you could say that the reason why cognition can play this imperialistic role is because computing pervades our understanding of ourselves now, and therefore it can also be projected to things like caste, which I talk about in my book, that so far would have been seen as only social phenomena.
Yeah.
Right? So how is it that caste has managed to adapt to our technological society, right? Where it's no longer about the reproduction of livelihoods, but about the reproduction of actually, in the straightforward sense, right? That very few people expect you to be in the same livelihood as your parents, but they definitely, for the most part in India, you are the same caste as your parents.
Yeah. Can you ask them to just clear? Yeah. Just tell them there's a recording. Sorry.
Is it lunchtime? No, it's not that late.
We will go in a while. Yeah. I think we can continue, but I'll just coming in. So, Fazia, just ask Ryan if he can continue talking. The recording is still on, right? Anyway, yeah. So yeah, yeah. Just close it. No, it can go a little bit more. Oh, so I want to take a slight segue into this thing that it seems you're quite apologetic about the imperialistic tendency of cognition as a concept, because I was getting one of my cultural studies colleagues to just flip through a book, and he said that, oh, there are so many sweeping statements, very provocative, and to that, it was, so my defense of that was that forget about cognition. When you look at all these authors who are trending these days talking about the human condition, like Yuval Noah Harari, they too have the, if you like, the imperialist confidence to talk on the behalf of whole humanity. So, I mean, what's wrong if you do the same for all Indians, so to speak, with due disclaimers everywhere. So, what does that
I wouldn't
like
even stop
defense?
with Indians. I would, meaning I also want to speak not just for all humanity, but for all living things.
Yeah.
I think that's why I think cognition is a great concept, because you could argue that it is a concept that at least generalizes to biology, if not to things beyond it, right? And I'm not apologetic about that at all. I struggle with it because I also, appreciate, say, a more traditional humanities discipline like history, where the particular is so much more important than the sweeping generalization.
Yeah.
I do, at the same time, my own thinking is very much about the sweeping generalization, right?
Yeah.
When it works, I think it's great. And I'm of the mind that even if it doesn't work all the time, it's a way of doing scholarship that needs to be there, right? And especially in a country like India, which is where the particularization of our humanities discourse is quite strong, right? We don't have a vibrant intellectual sphere in which some people are behaving as universalists and others as particularists, right? So I think it's good to have a way of thinking about India that is as general as possible.
True, and in fact, to take that point further, initially when you dive into the book, there is this inevitable expectation that you having a big background in the brain science, will suddenly give us a revelation that you've discovered these set of neurons, or
the India neurons.
The India neurons and stuff like that. But you never quite obviously do that, and you try to, if I call that as a sleight of hand, expand cognition, the study of cognition, to include this political science, sociology, and all those insights. But what is your view of that idea? Like, do we have India neurons? Like,
I'm sure we don't actually, right? But what I mean is that if we are not so reductive, let's say that you had access to, and this is something we should do. I'm not saying I should do or you should do, but as a society, we should invest in. If we were to, let's say, image, I don't know, 100,000 Indian brains.
Yeah.
Right? Really deep, very good, well done, baseline setting brain scans of pretty representative population of Indians. Whether it is going to be 1,000, 100,000, million, I don't know, right? But some large number. I would say that we will discover some interesting things which won't come under the India neuron, but will still be, here is how our brains are a little bit different, or some systematic ways. How good is that for a culture studies person? I don't particularly care so much.
Yeah.
But if we were to do cultural neuroscience, I think that's a reference data set that we should have.
That's interesting, because just the other day I was talking to a friend of mine who was doing an anthropology of the use of neuroscience in the discourses of medicine, psychedelic research and stuff like that. And one of the interesting things he reveals is that some of the people in the field of mental health, while they may here and there refer to the discourse of neuroscience as a prop in their conversation to make a point, they're pretty much convinced that there is no such magic wand neural solution to things.
Yeah.
And actually this conviction of mine got reinforced when I was talking to these people who had, in marketing, and who even had a crack at this concept called neuromarketing. Can we directly so this fantasy,
right,
even though it probably could not ever be practically tenable, and maybe not even in scientific terms, could be the wrong question to ask also. But I think that the metaphors of neuroscience now, with the
right,
idea of plasticity, for example,
right,
is being deployed in many new ways.
Yes.
Is is having a currency,
right,
much across discourses, right?
Right.
So
I actually think, let's take plasticity, right?
Yeah.
I'm blanking on the French philosopher, I forgot, Veronica, who has brought that into philosophy in a very interesting way.
I think it's Catherine Malabou.
Yeah, Catherine Malabou, that's right.
Yeah.
So I think neuroscience can be a source of profound philosophical concepts that are not reductive. Just as earlier ideas like rationality. I mean, rationality is such an important philosophical concept. It doesn't have to be reduced to a very narrow idea, right? Of say mathematical logic or something like that. So I think plasticity that way is an important philosophical concept. And just as we take concepts that are fundamentally social and make them important, let's take something like rights. I mean, if you think rights are worth talking about in universities and in society and putting it into governance, right? Why not plasticity? I mean, that's why I would see it. But I think it should not be done in this antagonistic way, right? There is a style of doing imperialism, to use that term, right? Yeah. Where I am right and all of that is crap.
Yeah.
We don't have to do it that way.
Yeah.
But we can say that, look, there's genuinely something new to be discovered by bringing the insights together rather than one lording it over the other.
On that note, because I'm sure you keep a tab on neuroscience a lot, is there any other new concept that is lurking around which you find like could be very interesting in the research that's happening nowadays?
I mean, definitely, I don't know if it is neuroscience or not. Generalization and learning are important concepts.
I see.
I mean, generalization is
Yeah.
so important in machine learning, right? And machine learning now is everywhere. I mean, I would say that if anything, our technologies of intelligence are more productive than our sciences of intelligence.
True. In fact, I have a friend who was a batchmate at Kanpur. His name is Pravesh Kothari. He is now teaching in Carnegie Mellon. He has a course called the Computational Lens, where it is a course in computer science, ideas of computer science deliberately meant for non-computer scientists. And that's where he does talk about learning as a concept that has a currency in exactly the philosophical sense you mean.
Yes.
So he's actually teaching that as part of the course.
I mean, if you take since we started this conversation with psychology, right?
Yeah.
Take the phrase psyche. Psyche has been a very productive philosophical concept, especially when Freudian ideas were more popular than they are today.
Yeah.
Right? So much work in the humanities, in literature, in philosophy, used psyche as an explanatory concept. We don't do that so much anymore, right? But for a while it was quite productive, and that was you could say the growing science of that time. So if computing is an important part of our socio-cultural framework, why not borrow concepts from it? How to do that well is a separate question, right? But I think learning, adaptivity, generalization, these are all concepts that should be turned into philosophically rich explanatory concepts.
Yeah. I was looking at, for example, let's come back to your book again, the way you discussed caste, for example, and the role of cognition in the way caste plays out, the sensorial basis of caste, whether it is the idea of touch,
right,
even sight, or all those other senses involved. In that sense, I was reminded of, I'm sure you know the work of scholars like Gopal Guru and how they talked about the phenomenology of touch.
Yes.
And how do you see, is your project in some sense converging with that phenomenological approach? Because, of course, if you go back in time, all these disciplines then again, mix up with each other before they individuated. So I was reminded of that.
In actual practice, meaning my own scholarly development, I haven't engaged as much with the Husserlian phenomenological tradition, though I have very close friends, collaborators who are phenomenologists in that sense, right? But the sensorium in particular as a source of understanding social formations is an underexplored part of the social sciences, right? And I don't, so when you say, touch is an obvious thing for caste because there are all kinds of taboos against touch, but the other senses, the visual demarcations between the castes, especially the smell and auditory demarcations, how people talk, right, would be hard to do in the phenomenological approach in the Husserlian sense in some ways. But with, again, if we have phenomenological technology, right, where let's say we get much more fine-grained sensory data on how different castes, how do the smells literally of say homes in different caste formations, are there patterns that you can point to? I think would be an interesting kind of cognitive slash technological slash social investigation.
Yeah,
I should also say if we should do this very carefully because it leads to a kind easily lends itself to discrimination, right? So caste in particular is a difficult place to do that, but I think it's an interesting research program.
Yeah, and in fact, the whole idea, one of the things which you talk about, the idea of caste as a thermodynamic system,
right?
Which is something that I am quite fascinated by, because one of the things that I've long wanted to pursue is, when people like Ambedkar and Tard talk about the contingency of the caste system, meaning that how the caste system keeps evolving. And if you add that to the fact that Tard does talk about this molecular conception of individuals,
right.
so to speak.
Right.
So there is truly a nascent thermodynamic imagination which people like them, sort of suggest. And I find it interesting, how this fits into this the theoretical approach of cognition,
Right.
Yeah.
I think questions of equilibrium, of dynamics, of steady states, and dynamical states. That's my, you could say, physics, mathematics, education showing itself even in cognitive science, and then in the study of things like caste, right? And I think they're again very productive concepts. Economics has made great use of them. Right? After all, equilibrium is as much now an economics concept as it is a physics concept.
True.
And I think that it shouldn't stick only to economics and physics. I think that it's a good concept to be applied to the social sciences more broadly.
Yeah, and I want to then sort of tie this together with the point that you made about Husserlian phenomenology, because you mentioned this fact that this question of who are we is a question where we are examining whose subject matter keeps changing, because who we are can keep changing. India itself, the notion of India can keep changing, and there's this passage where you talk about how in that sense the idea of science must change, because it cannot be an isolated laboratory experiment which is done in its own leisure,
right.
Which in a way reminds me of the Husserlian phenomenological process, where you go through the process of ideatic reduction in a kind of stable, isolated atmosphere, and there is no real way of doing Husserlian ideatic variation at a fast pace over a population. So I see that is where I see, in that sense, cognition, the way you imagine it, has great theoretical relevance for analyzing data that is changing very fast, and still making sense of it.
Right. So I should say this, that there are Husserlian phenomenologists who certainly Merleau-Ponty onwards, who would be less about that stable eidetic variation, right? But I don't know enough of the literature to comment there. I do think cognition, because it can be married to technological systems, is a good theoretical framework for precisely that reason, right? That it is actually well designed for a fast changing world. And, but somebody still has to do that research, right? It can't just
yeah. It's in some sense what you're. I think. Should I say that you suggesting a research program for us,
yes.
Right? Which would you care to tell us of any researchers in India or abroad who you think are, not consciously maybe, but are kind of doing are implementing this vision of using cognition as a
there is definitely a certain older cognitive anthropology world with people like Scott Atran, Douglas Medine, and others. But cognitive science is not a unified discipline, right? It's not like physics where everybody agrees what the foundations are. And so, in this newer, sort of more adaptive form of cognitive science, I think the people who probably come closest are the ones, say, who are doing data-driven humanities of various kinds. Not just digital humanities, but people who are ingesting large numbers of texts or looking at very large data sets and using that to make conclusions.
Would you say experimental philosophy is something of that sort, this new thing?
Definitely, it has some value there,
yeah.
Right? And let's say that instead of doing trolley problems in the abstract,
yeah.
you study lots and lots of people and take their views on trolley problems, which is what experimental philosophy would do.
Exactly.
That is definitely in the right direction, right?
Yeah.
I think the main question is, of course, experimental philosophy has been applied to mathematics and to society, politics, and other things. Getting out of the lab, I think, is important. Right? Experimental philosophy is still bringing people into a lab.
True.
Right? And I think what our data gathering capacities with the tech we have is enabling is to do this out there, where we are now, and not in a lab.
That's where I think your disposition is so refreshingly different from all other humanities scholars, because these are exactly the kind of things they are worry about. That there is surveillance technologies which they think is which they are cynical about, whereas many of these surveillance technologies make that kind of data gathering possible. So, like you talked about scanning 100,000 brains. You say that to a cultural humanities scholar, and they would say that's blasphemy. How could you even think of that?
Right.
So.
Let's put it this way. My own friends there are people who are very close friends who would say that.
Yeah.
Right. I definitely have that geek side of me that thinks this is good.
Yeah.
Frankly, we wouldn't have the current culture studies, traditional social science, if you did not have the state with its data gathering capacities of censuses and population statistics and things like that, right? Those, we just take that for granted.
True.
So the next wave, and that too was used for surveillance and for...
Exactly. So, for our audience, I just want to re-articulate the point that Professor is making, is that in any case, when you don't evidently feel the trace of the surveillance on your body, but when people are using data and charts about large populations, that seems to be like a sort of more innocent thing, but that is a kind of surveillance in hindsight, if not an active surveillance. So I think that's and if you're okay with that, if you're willing to make room for that, then why not concede this? So
I totally understand that there are at best neutral motives and often very sinister motives behind data collection at large scale. But what that tells me is that you need a politics that addresses it, not to turn your eyes away from it. In the same way that in the 19th century, if you didn't pay attention to industrialization, you would have not anticipated the politics that emerged.
True. And in fact, this conversation reminded me, because I was looking at the works of this Indian statistician Mahalanobis. And he had this very interesting side of him, which was invested in anthropometry. And now the very idea of anthropometry would strike someone as extremely incorrect, right? but he was actually wanting to apply more rigorous statistics to do anthropometry, to actually sort of debunk many biases about caste and race. So for example, there is this device he has called the profiloscope, which is about measuring the features of people's faces and the proportions, and he wanted to prove, like, there was this myth that people from different castes have different features. But he said that he did some analysis, and he went around and said, look, actually, if you are from the same region, it doesn't matter. If you're from different castes, you actually look more similar than people from other regions. So I think that's kind of what you're suggesting.
Yeah, and I mean, there is maybe a romantic idea of scholarship where you don't have an ideological axe to grind as well, right? But of course, I mean, there are some questions that are clearly more likely to be misused than others, and any kind of measurements of physiognomy or including those 100,000 brain scans, I mean, there is an obvious danger that once you have that, you never know who's going to use it for what. True. Right? And that has to be guarded against, and therefore any such data, I mean, this is data ethics 101, right? That if you now collect data sets at scale, you need to have very robust systems that also programmatically say how should that data be accessed and under what conditions and by whom.
True.
Right?
Yeah.
To me, that's the solution. The solution is in a new data ethics rather than in assuming that you can assimilate it to a previous era of how to handle data.
So on that note, I thought if you have any questions, you can just ask him, and I will paraphrase it again for the
So thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure. I love how you are not hesitant to talk about philosophy and the role it has in psychological studies. And yesterday I was briefing through your article. You said that every discipline has sort of matured and left philosophy.
Right.
So especially with the idea of cognitive humanities, this humanistic approach to understanding social institutions from a psychological perspective. How do you approach that personally while still not being fast and loose with the neuroscientific literature and applying it to social construct?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a great easy thing to paraphrase, but I'll do it. I'll do it. So yeah, I mean, I think what Faziha is talking about is the fact that as of now, psychology has become a very it's become a very experimental routine kind of discipline, where I think philosophical questions, at least largely in India, are sort of just taken for granted. So in a sense, this bringing back philosophy to psychology is welcome. And on that note, like how every discipline, if it asks a fundamental enough question, it becomes something like philosophy. And like you said, the whole idea of bringing psychology to questions within the humanities without playing fast and loose with neuroscientific works. I mean, I can't wait help adding to that, because I think there is a presumption perhaps there is that neuroscientific works are in some sense sacrosanct, like there is some, but I wonder if that is the case. But yeah, it's just to you.
So I might actually, in the Tardean sense, bring the social into the neuroscience, right? So which is to say that how do you do a social science of neurons is as important a question as how do you do a cognitive science of society.
Can you elaborate a little bit?
So what I mean is that if you think of the social as a certain way of understanding connection,
okay,
right? Then just as Tard would have said that we are a society of cells, Is that an actual meaning? A biologist might say that's just a metaphor. It doesn't have any productive meaning for me as a scientist. If we can actually dispute that and say, no, here is how it is actually a productive concept for you, then you have brought social science into biology rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's possible with cognitive science and society. Right? That's why society, I think, is a good concept for me, because it's not one taking over the other kind of concept. It's actually a merger concept. And I feel like, especially today when neural technologies are coming up, being able to analyze those and the new ideas of humanness that are coming alongside that, we can't do that justice to them without social science concepts.
I just can't help, because, and I will end our thing on this note, because that proposition that you had, that you're talking about the social science of neurons, and I completely understand what you're trying to say is, like if you think of society of cells, can concepts and metaphors from social sciences bear upon how neurons interact with each other? I would just like to know, because I feel that when we do such, we propose such ideas, we also there is an expectation of science that it won't be as speculative, right? So, social sciences, often, anthropologists, many anthropologists can afford to be very speculative. Like they can give you a loaded conjecture, and they can never choose to verify it. Whereas the expectation with science usually, and I know that's a caricature, is that you are very light on the speculation part, and you have hypotheses and experiments, and and if they reveal such interesting or puzzling results, you come up with new speculations. But what is the room for such speculative possibilities from your experience in actual neuroscience? Do you see that happening?
I mean, let's take something like game theory, which was, after all, if you know, game theory came up in economics, right?
True.
Morgenstern and von Neumann write a theory, a book about games in economic decision making, but it has been very profoundly relevant to ecology and to biology, right? To evolutionary biology in particular. And so, even with that idea of being rigorous and non-speculative, one can borrow concepts from the social sciences and apply them to the biological sciences at least.
True.
Right? And there's a very, there are famous game theorists in economics, and there are famous game theorists in ecology and in biology, right? So that's a successful transplant in my view. But that still doesn't tell me how you can be speculative in the neurosciences, but actually the idea that the brain is a computer is a fantastically important idea, which was very speculative 75 years ago, maybe less speculative now.
Yeah, it sounds very normal now.
Yeah. So it's been done.
Yeah. I think that's a great note to end, to sort of recognize once again the speculative concepts in science,
right,
that we take for granted. And I think these conversations are meant to make us more self-aware of these things. But yeah, thank you again, Dr. Rajesh. It's a pleasure talking to you. I hope you'll be back again and again to do many rounds of these because I think we have barely scratched the surface, because I had loads. I didn't cover the book really, but we did talk about quite a few things. But yeah, thank you again.
Thank you so much.